was born in 1940 in the small rural community of Wilkinson County, Mississippi, where the world seemed to move at the slow rhythm of fields, church bells, and the distant hum of machinery that never belonged to her family. Her earliest memories were of the smell of damp earth after rain and the creak of the old house her parents shared before their marriage fractured under the strain of poverty. She was a quiet child, one who watched before she spoke, who studied the world with a seriousness far beyond her years. In the cotton fields, where she worked from a young age to help support her family, Anne learned to read people the way others read books. She noticed the fear in her mother's eyes whenever the white landowner rode by. She noticed the way black adults lowered their voices when discussing anything that might sound like dissatisfaction. Even as a child, she sensed the presence of something larger and invisible pressing down on everyone around her. When her father left, Anne felt the world tilt, forcing her to grow faster than she should have. Her mother moved her and her siblings into a series of small, cramped homes, each one seeming to shrink with every passing year as work remained scarce and money even scarcer. Anne learned early how to cook, how to quiet a crying sibling, how to keep her own questions tucked behind her teeth. But the questions were always there, burning like small sparks waiting for air. Why were they always poor when they worked so hard? Why were white children free to run through the town with shoes that never seemed to wear out while she walked barefoot across gravel roads? Why did adults tell her to be careful when she spoke, as if words had the power to bring danger to their door? School became the one place where Anne's mind felt untethered. Her teachers noticed her hunger for learning, the way she devoured lessons with an intensity that startled them. Books opened a window, and through it she glimpsed worlds untouched by Mississippi's rigid lines of race and poverty. In those stories, she met characters who dared to dream, dared to question, dared to act. She read about battles for freedom in distant countries and wondered why no one around her spoke of the fight for freedom happening in her own backyard. This curiosity grew into something fierce and persistent. A quiet rebellion that began forming long before she found a larger movement to join. By the time Anne reached adolescence, she understood the rules of Mississippi as clearly as the multiplication tables her teachers drilled into her. A black girl was expected to work hard, keep her eyes low, and accept the boundaries drawn long before she was born. But even as she followed these rules outwardly, she observed them with an increasingly critical mind. She noticed the separate entrances at stores, the segregated seating on buses, the school buildings that seemed to crumble each year while the white school across town gleamed with fresh paint. She noticed the whispers about lynchings, the way fear traveled through the community without needing to be spoken aloud. These observations pressed into her memory, forming a quiet archive she held close, one she never imagined would one day become a book studied by students across the nation. Her first job was cleaning the home of a white family in Centerville. She was only 12, but already supporting her family was more obligation than choice. As she swept floors and polished furniture, she listened carefully to the conversations that floated through the house. She learned how differently the white family spoke about opportunity, how casually they assumed the future belonged to them. The contrast sharpened Anne's understanding of her world. She did not yet have the vocabulary to define the injustice, but she felt it deeply. Each word she heard, each moment she witnessed, settled into her mind like ink on paper. In those same years, violence struck close enough to touch. The murder of Emmett Till in 1955 became a turning point for many young African Americans. And for Anne, it felt like a door slamming shut on any illusion of safety. She was 15 when she saw the Jet magazine photographs of Till's mutilated body. The image seared itself into her memory, reshaping her understanding of the stakes they all lived with. She asked her mother why such things happened, and her mother, exhausted and protective, told her not to question what she could not change. But Anne could not accept silence. Not anymore. The world had announced itself in horrific detail, and she had no choice but to listen. As Anne grew older, she began to write small thoughts in notebooks she used for school. They were not yet memoirs, not yet reflections meant for the world, but observations and questions she could not voice aloud. In the privacy of her room, she wrote about the contradictions she saw every day, about the anger that simmered beneath her calm exterior, about her longing for a life where her worth was not measured by the color of her skin or the weight of her family's poverty. The notebook became a confidant, a place where her thoughts could stretch without fear. She wrote about her dreams of attending college, about the shame she sometimes felt for wanting more than survival, and about the quiet determination that told her she was meant for something beyond the boundaries of Mississippi's cotton fields. Her teenage years unfolded in a world balancing on the edge of transformation. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, though it had not yet reached the small corners of Mississippi where Anne lived. But she felt its tremors in the stories whispered by traveling preachers, in the cautious hope she saw in the eyes of older community members, in the unspoken understanding that their world would not remain frozen forever. Anne continued to listen, to observe, to absorb everything around her. Even without realizing it, she was gathering the pieces of the story she would one day share with the nation. By the time she prepared to leave for college, she carried more than clothes or books. She carried years of questions, memories, and the quiet resilience that would shape her future. She stepped away from the fields and the small houses of her childhood, with a mind sharpened by struggle and a heart full of unspoken stories. The girl who had spent her life listening to the world was ready to find her voice, and the first echoes of it were already forming on the pages of her notebook, waiting for the moment when they would become the foundation of a memoir that would change how America understood its own history. College was a world Anne Moody had imagined so many times that stepping onto the campus of Natchez Junior College in 1959 felt like crossing a threshold between the life she had known and the life she hoped to claim. The buildings were modest and weathered, but to Anne they looked like monuments to possibility. She carried with her a battered notebook she had been filling since her final year in high school. Its pages were packed with questions she had never dared to ask aloud, observations that troubled her, and memories she could not forget. That notebook became her companion in those early weeks, a shield against the uncertainty of a new world and a vessel for the thoughts she was only beginning to understand. Anne arrived at Natchez hungry for knowledge and weary from the burdens she carried. She still sent money home when she could and worried constantly about her family. But for the first time in her life, she had space to think, to breathe, to push her mind beyond the narrow constraints Mississippi had imposed on her. In classrooms, she felt her mind ignite. Her instructors encouraged discussion, critical thinking, and the questioning of long-accepted truths. Anne thrived in this environment. She poured herself into her studies, often spending long nights reading, writing, and filling her notebook with reflections that grew sharper with each passing month. Yet even as she expanded her intellectual world, the darkness of segregation shadowed every corner of her experience. Natchez Junior College was a segregated black institution with limited funding, outdated materials, and buildings in need of repair. Students made do because they had to. They learned to stretch resources, to share books, to fix what was broken. Anne saw the contrast clearly whenever she passed the white college in town, or heard stories from students who had grown up near better-equipped schools. The inequities she had witnessed since childhood were still present, now in sharper relief. The cruel logic behind them became impossible to ignore. In the dining hall and dormitory common rooms, students discussed the rising tide of the civil rights movement. Sit-ins were spreading across the South. Freedom riders were challenging segregated bus terminals. Activists in other states were confronting the very system that held Mississippi in its grip. Anne listened at first, absorbing every detail. She had spent most of her life being told to stay quiet, to keep her head down, to avoid trouble. But trouble had always found her community anyway. The injustice she had seen and lived could no longer be explained away as simply the way things were. Something inside her stirred as she realized the questions filling her notebook were the same ones being asked by people risking their lives across the country. It was at Natchez that Anne first encountered the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Though only through whispered conversations and quickly passed pamphlets, NAACP activity in Mississippi was dangerous. The organization was banned in many counties, and membership could lead to harassment, job loss, or even death. In Anne's hometown, people spoke the letters NAACP with caution, as if uttering them too loudly might draw unwanted attention. But in college, she met students who admired activists like Medgar Evers, who had become a central figure in Mississippi's fight for justice. His work investigating lynchings, organizing boycotts, and pushing for school integration made him a beacon for young people searching for direction. Anne wrote his name in her notebook the day she first heard it, circling it as if marking a path her life might someday follow. Her transition to Tougaloo College the following year intensified everything she had begun to feel and question. Tougaloo was unlike any place she had ever known. Supported by northern churches and run by educators committed to academic freedom, the campus fostered open discussion and encouraged courageous thought. It was one of the few places in Mississippi where Black students could speak honestly about the society that oppressed them, without immediate fear of punishment. On her first day there, the air felt different. Possibilities shimmered like heat rising from the pavement. Tougaloo quickly became the center of civil rights organizing in the state. Students held secret meetings. Professors discussed national events with a level of openness Anne had never experienced. And activists passed through campus regularly, seeking help or offering training. Anne absorbed it all, writing furiously in her notebook after these meetings, trying to capture every idea, every strategy, every piece of history unfolding before her eyes. Her writing deepened, shifting from personal reflection to detailed accounts of what she witnessed. She wrote about conversations with fellow students who had survived violence, about the courage she saw in young organizers preparing for sit-ins, about the fear that still gripped her despite her growing determination. In 1961, the Freedom Rides reached Mississippi, and Tougaloo became a haven for those who had been arrested and released from the Jackson jails. Anne met some of them, listening to their stories of shattered bus windows, beatings, and unwavering resolve. They described how mobs attacked them as police stood by, how they braced themselves for imprisonment, how they refused to respond with violence even when violence surrounded them. Anne felt the weight of their stories settling inside her. Each testimony sharpened her understanding of the movement. These were not distant figures in newspaper clippings. They were people her age, sharing meals in the cafeteria, sitting beside her in the chapel. Their courage illuminated her own path. Anne's growing involvement in civil rights work was not sudden, but steady, like a tide rising slowly until one realizes it has transformed the entire landscape. She joined the NAACP Youth Council in Jackson, where Medgar Evers became one of her mentors. His calm intensity, strategic mind, and unyielding commitment to justice deeply influenced her. Under Evers' leadership, she learned how to organize boycotts, how to canvass neighborhoods, how to speak to people who were afraid but yearning for change. She also learned the danger of visibility. Evers was constantly followed, threatened, and targeted. Anne understood that by working alongside him, she was stepping further into the path of risk. But she felt ready. Her notebook became a record not just of thoughts, but of her transformation. Her first major action came in 1963, when she participated in the Woolworth sit-in in Jackson. It was a moment that marked her life forever. She and several other students sat at the whites-only lunch counter, knowing violence was inevitable. As they refused to move, a mob surrounded them, shouting, spitting, hitting, and pouring condiments over their heads. Anne felt ketchup sliding down her back, burning her scraped skin. She felt fists and feet strike her, but she remained seated, hands clenched, refusing to retaliate. The brutality of the crowd revealed the depth of hatred sustaining segregation. The courage of her fellow students revealed the depth of resolve required to challenge it. That night, back in her dormitory, Anne opened her notebook with shaking hands. She wrote about the fear, the chaos, the moments when she thought she might lose consciousness. She wrote about the strength she felt rising inside her as she held her seat. She wrote about the faces twisted with rage, the perverse satisfaction some people took in assaulting peaceful students. Most of all, she wrote about why she stayed. She knew the world needed to understand what everyday people endured in Mississippi. She knew silence would only feed the darkness she had lived with her entire life. Her notebook was no longer a private refuge. It had become a lifeline, a way to preserve the truth in a time when truth was under attack. The words she wrote began forming the earliest threads of what would one day become her memoir. She did not know yet how far they would travel, or how many would study them in classrooms. She only knew that if she did not write these stories, the world might never understand the courage required to confront the darkness. Tougaloo College in the early 1960s was unlike any institution in Mississippi. To outsiders, it looked like a quiet liberal arts campus tucked behind rows of trees and modest academic buildings. But to those who lived and studied there, it was one of the few sanctuaries in the state where young black men and women could think freely about the world they wanted to build. For Anne Moody, Tougaloo was not just a school. It was a turning point, a place where she stepped out of the shadows of fear and into the fire of organized resistance. These years would change her forever. From the moment she arrived, Anne felt the energy humming beneath the surface. Students whispered about meetings held in empty classrooms after dark, about professors who had marched with activists in other states, about guests who visited campus quietly, speaking with students under the watchful eyes of local authorities. Tougaloo was closely monitored by Mississippi's white power structure. Yet it continued to nurture a generation of activists who refused to accept the state's rigid racial hierarchy. Anne was drawn quickly into this world. Her academic classes sharpened her understanding of history and politics. But it was her involvement in student-led organizations that transformed her from a curious observer into a committed activist. The NAACP Youth Council in Jackson became her second home. She traveled back and forth between Tougaloo and the city, helping to organize boycotts, participate in discussions, and strategize ways to confront segregation. Each meeting pulled her further from the life she had lived as a child and deeper into the movement reshaping the American South. One of the most influential figures in Anne's life during these years was Medgar Evers. He was the field secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi and the central force behind many of the campaigns that challenged segregation across the state. Anne admired his calm determination, his willingness to face danger, and his deep belief that young people were essential to the fight. Evers treated Anne with respect, pushing her to think critically and encouraging her to take on roles she never imagined she could handle. She listened to him speak about murdered activists, about families driven from their homes, about cases he investigated where justice was denied time after time. Every story etched itself into her memory. Through Evers, she also saw the toll activism took. He was constantly followed, his home was firebombed, and he was threatened relentlessly. Anne learned that change required sacrifice. She watched him work until exhaustion carved lines into his face, and yet he never stopped. His resilience became a guide for her. Anne's own activism intensified in 1963 as protests and sit-ins swept across Jackson. She became a key participant, not because she sought visibility, but because she believed deeply in the necessity of action. One of her most defining moments, the Woolworth sit-in, unfolded on May 28, 1963. Anne, along with Tougaloo students Perlina Lewis and Memphis Norman, walked into the segregated Woolworth store on Capitol Street and took seats at the whites-only lunch counter. They did not speak. They simply sat, waiting to be served, knowing they would not be. The violence erupted quickly. A white mob crowded around them, shouting insults, pouring sugar, ketchup, and mustard over their heads. Someone struck Norman, dragging him from his seat and beating him violently as police stood by. Anne remained seated, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her lap as she felt condiments drip down her face and clothes. A woman leaned close and hissed insults inches from her ear. Another jabbed her with an elbow. A man behind her lit a match and held it near her hair. Through it all she stayed, clenching her jaw, anchored by purpose. Photographs taken that day circulated around the world, showing Anne with mustard sliding down her arm as she sat with unbroken resolve. Those images became a symbol of Mississippi's brutality and the courage of the young people challenging it. That night, Anne wrote everything she could remember in her notebook. She wrote about the rage in the crowd's eyes, about the strange calm she felt even as she was assaulted, about the way violence seemed to rise like a tide that could drown the whole city. The Woolworth sit-in marked Anne indelibly. It was a moment when fear no longer controlled her. She had seen the worst of what segregation could produce. Yet she had also seen her own strength. That experience propelled her deeper into activism. Tougaloo's campus reflected this growing commitment among students. Meetings with the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, drew increasing numbers of young people. Organizers trained students in nonviolent resistance, preparing them for arrests, beatings, and intimidation. Anne absorbed these teachings with intensity. She learned how to stay calm under pressure, how to de-escalate, how to endure the emotional toll of activism. She learned that the movement was a community, built on shared purpose and mutual trust. The summer of 1963 brought events that shook Anne to her core. On June 12th, Medgar Evers was assassinated outside his home in Jackson. Anne remembered the moment she heard the news. Shock washed over Tougaloo's campus like a storm. Students cried openly. Professors stood in doorways, struggling to find words. Anne felt something shatter inside her. She had known Evers as a mentor, a guide, a beacon in the fight for justice. His murder underscored the lethal cost of activism in Mississippi. It also hardened her resolve. She attended his funeral, watching mourners line the streets and listening to the grief in the voices of those who had worked beside him. That day became another entry in her notebook, written with trembling hands and a heavy heart. The movement did not slow. Mississippi erupted in a battle over education, voting rights, and economic equality. Anne participated in voter registration efforts, canvassing neighborhoods where Black residents lived under constant threat. Many were afraid to open their doors. Some whispered their support, but refused to sign their names on registration forms, knowing white employers or landowners could retaliate. Anne understood their fear intimately. Yet she pushed forward, believing strongly that change required collective courage. Her college years also revealed the deep emotional toll activism took. She struggled with exhaustion, frustration, and the weight of seeing so much suffering. But she also experienced profound moments of unity. She remembered singing freedom songs during marches, the harmonies rising like a shield against despair. She remembered late-night conversations with fellow students who spoke honestly about their hopes, fears, and dreams. She remembered feeling, for the first time in her life, that she was part of something larger than herself. As Anne neared graduation, she felt the changes within her solidify. She was no longer the quiet girl from rural Mississippi who wrote down her questions in secret. She was an activist, a young woman forged by witnessing injustice and confronting it directly. Her notebook had grown thick with entries documenting not only her experiences, but the experiences of countless others whose stories might otherwise be lost. These years had transformed her. Tougaloo had given her a voice. The movement had given her purpose. And the world she had once listened to from the margins was now one she was determined to help reshape. The civil rights movement surged forward in the early 1960s with a momentum that neither intimidation nor violence could suppress. For Anne Moody, now deeply woven into the fabric of activism across Mississippi, these years became a testament to the power of collective voices rising against oppression. She had seen what happened when individuals acted alone in a state determined to maintain segregation at any cost. But she had also seen what happened when people united, when voices that had once whispered dared to speak, then shout, then demand. The movement was no longer a distant idea. It was a force she lived inside every day. Her work with the NAACP Youth Council expanded rapidly. She canvassed neighborhoods, organized boycotts, and attended strategy meetings where the risks of every action were discussed with the seriousness of battle planning. Mississippi was the most dangerous state in the country for civil rights activism. Every step forward came with threats, surveillance, and retaliation. Yet Anne felt a sense of inevitability growing. She believed change was coming, even if the journey toward it was steeped in hardship. One of the central concerns in Mississippi was voter registration. Black citizens made up nearly half the population in some counties, yet their presence on voting rolls barely registered. White officials used poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright intimidation to keep registrations low. Anne and other activists visited homes day after day, urging people to claim their constitutional right to vote. Many were afraid. Some said openly that they could not risk losing their jobs or having their homes burned. Yet others stepped forward, trembling as they signed their names, knowing full well the consequences. Anne documented these moments in her notebook, describing the elderly man who whispered that he had waited his whole life to see just one thing change, or the young mother who said she wanted her children to grow up in a world where they did not have to bow their heads. Each story strengthened Anne's resolve. These were the voices she fought for. These were the voices Mississippi tried to silence. In 1964, the movement prepared for what would become one of its most pivotal initiatives, the Mississippi Freedom Summer. Organized by the Council of Federated Organizations, COFO, a coalition of civil rights groups including CENI-CC, CORE, and the NAACP, the project aimed to bring hundreds of volunteers into the state to assist with voter registration, education programs, and community organizing. Activists knew the plan would provoke violent backlash. They also knew the nation could not continue ignoring the brutality in Mississippi if young white students from the North were attacked alongside black activists. Anne watched as Tougaloo College became a training ground for volunteers who arrived from across the country. Many had never faced danger before. They listened as Anne and others explained what violence looked like in Mississippi, how to remain calm during arrests, how to endure harassment, and how to survive unexpected threats. Anne admired their courage, but worried for them. She knew firsthand that Mississippi punished outsiders with even greater ferocity. The fears proved tragically justified when 3 Freedom Summer workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, disappeared in Neshoba County. Anne remembered the dread that spread across campuses and meeting rooms as word circulated. Everyone feared the worst. When the bodies were discovered weeks later, buried in an earthen dam, the country reacted with shock. But for Anne and other Mississippi activists, this was not a revelation. Violence had always been the state's first tool of control. The difference now was the attention of the nation. These deaths added urgency to Anne's work. She traveled throughout the state visiting freedom schools, makeshift classrooms where children learned not just reading and writing, but Black history, citizenship, and critical thinking. The freedom schools were designed to counter the unequal, segregated education system that had deliberately limited Black students' futures. Anne saw children sitting in church basements and community centers, their eyes bright, eager to learn a history that had been denied to them. She remembered her own childhood classrooms, bare and underfunded, and she felt a surge of hope as she watched these students embrace a future that segregationists were powerless to stop. But the movement was not only about hope, it was also about confrontation. In late summer 1964, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, MFDP, challenged the all-white Mississippi delegation at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City. Anne followed the events closely, knowing how much work activists across the state had poured into the MFDP. The delegation, largely composed of sharecroppers, laborers, and everyday people, sought recognition as the legitimate representatives of Mississippi Democrats. Their argument was simple. Black Mississippians had been systematically excluded from voting. Therefore, the all-white delegation did not represent the state. Fannie Lou Hamer became the voice of this challenge. When she testified before the Credentials Committee, describing the beatings, threats, and harassment she endured simply for trying to register to vote, the entire nation heard the truth of Mississippi laid bare. Anne listened to the broadcast from Tougaloo, feeling as if Hamer were speaking the collective pain of their entire community. But despite the emotional impact of Hamer's testimony, political compromise resulted in a partial settlement that did not grant the MFDP the full seating they sought. Anne saw the disappointment on the faces of people who had risked their lives for the chance to be heard. Yet even in defeat, their voices resonated. The testimony of Hamer and others exposed Mississippi's violence on a national scale. Anne wrote in her notebook that the world had finally heard what Mississippi had tried for generations to hide. As the movement continued into 1965 and beyond, Anne grew more aware of the physical and emotional toll activism inflicted. She had seen friends arrested, beaten, and terrorized. She had watched families fracture under the pressure. She herself often felt exhaustion pressing down on her, yet she refused to step back. She could not unsee what she had seen, nor unknow what she knew. The movement was no longer something she participated in. It had become part of her identity. She continued her work with determination, moving between voter registration efforts, school integration campaigns, and community meetings. She documented everything, filling pages with observations of courage and cruelty, resilience and despair. Her writing took on new shape. It no longer served only as a diary of personal experience, but as a testimony of a collective struggle. These were the voices that refused to stay silent. They were the voices of farmers, students, domestic workers, preachers, and children. They were the voices of those who survived, those who were lost, and those who rose again after every blow Mississippi delivered. Anne carried their words, their pain, and their hope. She understood that the fight for justice required not only action, but memory. By the end of this chapter of her life, Anne felt the weight of history settling onto her shoulders. She knew she would continue the work, but she also understood the necessity of preserving the truth. Voices could be silenced, lives could be ended, but stories, if written and shared, could outlive even the darkest oppression. When Anne Moody left Tougaloo College in the mid-1960s, she carried with her more than memories of protests, meetings, and the long shadow of Mississippi's violence. She carried the weight of every story she had witnessed. She carried the faces of the people who had trusted her with their fears and hopes. She carried the knowledge that the civil rights movement had changed her forever. Yet the country still struggled to understand the depth of the battles fought in the Deep South. For Anne, writing became the bridge between lived experience and public memory. She had always kept notebooks, first as a teenager trying to make sense of poverty and racial divisions, and later as an activist documenting the brutality and courage she saw around her. But after college, those notebooks began to feel like something larger, like fragments of a story the world needed to hear. She knew that the violence, the everyday humiliations, and the bravery of ordinary black citizens could not remain trapped in the memories of those who endured them. Too many stories were already being lost. Too many people would never have the chance to speak. She began drafting her memoir while enrolled at Cornell University on a scholarship. Upstate New York was a world away from Mississippi. Snow blanketed the campus, something she had rarely seen growing up. Students moved through classrooms without the burden of segregation dictating every step. Yet Anne felt isolated. She missed the urgency and unity of Tougaloo. She missed the people she had fought beside. And she felt a growing frustration as she realized how little many Northerners understood about the realities of the South. They knew the headlines. They knew the names of murdered activists, but they did not know what it meant to live every day under the threat of racial violence. This realization pushed her deeper into writing. She began shaping her life story chronologically, from her childhood in rural Mississippi to her years as a young activist. She wrote honestly about the grinding poverty that defined her early years, the instability of her family life, and the fear that saturated every Black community in the Jim Crow South. She wrote about the contradictions she saw in her church, her schools, and the white households where she worked. She wrote about the slow burn of anger that fueled her activism long before she had the words to articulate it. Most importantly, she wrote about the movement. She recounted the Woolworth sit-in, the threats she received as her activism became more visible, the voter registration efforts that placed her and others in constant danger. She wrote about Medgar Evers' assassination and the grief that swept through Mississippi like a tidal wave. She wrote about Freedom's Summer and the heartbreak of watching volunteers, many of them young and idealistic, return home traumatized by what they had witnessed. She wrote about the relentless resistance activists faced from local officials, police departments, and white supremacist groups who believed they could outlast the movement through violence. Anne did not romanticize activism. She wrote bluntly about the internal tensions within civil rights organizations, the fear that activists experienced every day, and the exhaustion that often left her emotionally drained. She knew the movement needed to be remembered honestly, not as a series of tidy victories, but as a long, grueling fight in which progress was uncertain and survival was never guaranteed. Her manuscript, titled Coming of Age in Mississippi, took shape over several years. She worked on it intermittently while supporting herself through various jobs, including work as a domestic worker and a fundraiser for civil rights organizations. She revised chapters repeatedly, determined to capture not just events, but the emotional truth of each moment. Writing was painful at times. Revisiting the trauma she had lived through forced her to confront memories she had long tried to suppress. But she believed the story needed to be told, and she believed she was the one who had to tell it. In 1968, her memoir was published by Dial Press. The timing could not have been more critical. The nation was reeling from the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. Riots erupted in major cities. Americans were divided not only by race, but by questions about the direction of the country. In this moment of national turmoil, Anne's book arrived as a stark, unfiltered account of what the civil rights struggle looked like from the inside, through the eyes of a young Black woman who had risked her life for change. Coming of Age in Mississippi was immediately recognized as a landmark work. Critics praised its honesty, its clarity, and its refusal to dilute the harsh realities of the movement. Reviewers noted that Anne's voice cut through the rhetoric of politics and ideology, grounding the civil rights struggle in the daily lives of the people who experienced it. The book was raw, direct, and uncompromising. It revealed the movement not only as a collective effort, but as a deeply personal journey marked by fear, sacrifice, and moments of profound courage. Colleges and universities began assigning the memoir in history, sociology, and African American studies courses. Students who had grown up far from the South read Anne's descriptions of segregated classrooms, lynching threats, and sit-ins turned violent. Many were shocked by the detailed accounts of oppression that had been absent from their own textbooks. The book helped reshape how civil rights history was taught, emphasizing grassroots activism and the experiences of ordinary people rather than focusing solely on national leaders. Anne received letters from readers across the country. Some thanked her for telling a story they felt the world had ignored. Others wrote to say they had never understood the depth of injustice in the South until reading her book. Teachers, activists, and scholars cited her first-hand accounts as essential to understanding the movement's complexity. Yet the memoir was more than historical documentation. It was a testament to survival. It showed how a girl from a small town, working in cotton fields and white kitchens, could rise to challenge one of the most oppressive systems in American history. It showed how a movement formed not only from speeches and marches, but from the courage of countless individuals who refused to accept their assigned place in society. Anne's own relationship to activism changed in the years after the memoir's publication. The emotional toll of her work and the dangers she had faced weighed heavily on her. She stepped back from frontline organizing, choosing instead to let her writing speak where she no longer could. She understood that movements required many forms of participation. Her contribution, she believed, would endure through her story. And it did. Her memoir became not just a book, but a vessel for the voices she had carried with her since childhood. It preserved the truth of a Mississippi that many wished to forget. It forced the nation to confront the cruelty of racism and the resilience of those who resisted it. Most of all, it ensured that the movement's history would not belong solely to speeches and headlines, but to the lived experiences of the people who fought in the shadows and survived the darkness. When Coming of Age in Mississippi entered the world in 1968, it carried the weight of more than one woman's memories. It carried the weight of a generation that had come of age in the fire of Jim Crow, fought in the trenches of the civil rights movement, and witnessed both the triumphs and the agonies of a nation struggling to redefine itself. Yet the story's journey, from Anne Moody's notebook to a cornerstone of American education, did not unfold overnight. It grew slowly, steadily, through classrooms, communities, and conversations, reshaping how the history of the movement would be taught for decades to come. The first wave of attention arrived through critical acclaim. Reviewers recognized the book's stark honesty, its refusal to soften brutality, and its unusual perspective. At a time when many published civil rights narratives came from national leaders or well-known organizers, Anne's voice emerged from the grassroots. She spoke as a child who had survived the rural South, as a teenager awakening to injustice, and as a young woman who had stood on the front lines. Her memoir offered a panoramic view of life under segregation, grounded not in theory, but in lived reality. Professors at northern universities were among the first to adopt the book for coursework. They believed students needed to understand the movement not only through legal milestones or speeches, but through eyewitness accounts of ordinary people whose courage fueled change. The book's candid descriptions of everyday racism, violence, and hope challenged students who had grown up with sanitized versions of American history. Many wrote to Anne about the impact of reading her words, describing how the book reshaped their understanding of their country. As the years passed, Coming of Age in Mississippi spread beyond university classrooms. High school educators, many of whom were searching for material that depicted civil rights history authentically, began recommending the memoir. For students who had learned the simple narrative of Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and tidy victories, Anne's story revealed the complexity behind the movement. She showed them the persistence, fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty that activists carried every day. She showed them a world where rights were not given, but demanded at immense personal cost. The book also became an essential text for African American studies programs emerging in the 1970s. These departments sought to reclaim history by centering Black voices too long ignored. And Anne's memoir provided exactly what was needed. A first-hand account that bridged the personal and the political. Her descriptions of sharecropping, segregated schools, violent resistance, and grassroots organizing filled a gap in the historical record. Scholars cited her work in dissertations, books, and articles examining the deeper structures of racism in the American South. Meanwhile, Anne maintained a complicated relationship with her growing prominence. She valued the impact her book had on readers, but she did not seek the spotlight. The emotional toll of her activism continued to affect her, and she lived much of her later life away from public view, focusing on her writing and personal reflections. She understood that the memoir spoke for her, carrying forward a story she no longer felt able to retell in speeches or interviews. This distance only added to the power of her voice on the page. Her silence in public life reminded readers that the story existed because she had lived it, not because she wished to perform it. As the civil rights landscape evolved, educators increasingly recognized the memoir as a vital teaching tool. By the 1980s and 1990s, coming of age in Mississippi appeared on syllabi across the country. Students read about Anne's childhood in the Jim Crow South while also studying Brown versus Board of Education. They learned about her sit-in at Woolworth's alongside lessons on the student-led movement. They read her accounts of Medgar Evers' assassination as part of conversations about political violence and its chilling effect on democracy. Anne's descriptions of Freedom Summer and voter registration efforts also gained renewed relevance as debates about voting rights resurfaced in the United States. Teachers highlighted her writing to show how the fight for political participation had always been met with resistance. Her vivid scenes, from door-to-door canvassing to tense community meetings, brought history to life in ways traditional textbooks could not. What made the memoir indispensable was not only its historical accuracy, but its emotional clarity. Anne did not tell the story of the movement from a distance. She lived inside it and invited readers to feel its contradictions. She portrayed moments of triumph, such as the determination of Tougaloo students, alongside moments of deep disillusionment, including her disappointment at the political compromises that followed the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party's challenge in 1964. Her honesty about the movement's limitations, internal tensions, and personal sacrifices made the book a nuanced teaching resource. The memoir's reach expanded further when civil rights veterans, educators, and community leaders began using it in workshops, teacher trainings, and public forums. Many argued that Anne's story could guide discussions about racial inequality long after the movement's legislative victories. They believed the book offered a blueprint for understanding how systemic oppression operates in everyday life. Others viewed it as a model of youth activism, showing how young people, students, teenagers, and new organizers had driven many of the era's most significant confrontations. In the early 2000s, renewed national conversations about race, policing, poverty, and education gave Anne's memoir fresh urgency. Teachers assigned the book not only as history, but as a lens through which students could examine current events. Readers noticed parallels between Anne's descriptions of fear and resistance in Mississippi and ongoing struggles for racial justice. The memoir connected eras, showing that the fight for equality was not an isolated moment, but a continuous effort. Even as the book gained recognition, Anne's name did not always rise to the prominence of other civil rights figures. She never sought fame, and she rarely stepped into the public eye. Yet in classrooms, her story became unavoidable. Students learned her name alongside the names of leaders, strategists, and martyrs. Teachers emphasized that the civil rights movement was built not only by nationally celebrated figures, but also by people like Anne Moody, young, untrained, frightened, determined, who risked everything to confront injustice. By the time Anne Moody died in 2015, her memoir had been in circulation for nearly half a century. Its presence in classrooms had outlived the era it described. Teachers assigned it to students who had no memory of segregated schools, no personal connection to Jim Crow, and no first-hand understanding of the movement's stakes. Through Anne's voice, they encountered a world otherwise inaccessible to them. Coming of age in Mississippi had become more than a memoir. It had become a historical witness. It bore testimony to the countless unnamed individuals whose courage reshaped the country. It preserved the emotional landscape of a movement too often distilled into dates and speeches. It bridged generations, allowing new readers to feel the urgency of the struggle that defined Anne's youth. Most importantly, the memoir reached every classroom because it refused to let America forget. It transformed a teenager with a notebook into a guardian of memory, ensuring that the hardest truths of the past would continue to challenge the present. And through its pages, Anne Moody's voice, steady, unvarnished, and unafraid, continues to speak long after she is gone.